Before examining the changes made to slavery and the reasons behind them, it is essential to first understand slavery in its most basic, unaltered form. This approach allows us to identify the core features and limitations of slavery and how they influenced modifications that benefited slave-owning societies. While pure, unmodified slavery likely never existed, just as no economic system like capitalism, socialism, or feudalism has existed in a fully pure form, the concept serves as a valuable starting point. For many enslaved individuals who labored in the sugarcane and cotton fields of the Americas, their conditions closely resembled what could be considered pure slavery. The economics of slavery. As with all economic systems, slavery involved both costs and benefits. The benefits of slavery were primarily enjoyed by the enslavers, while the costs fell disproportionately on the enslaved. However, there were also costs associated with capturing people and maintaining the system itself. These costs were particularly distinct when the enslaved population differed racially from the free population. In ancient Rome, some Romans could be enslaved as punishment for crimes, but most slaves were non-Romans, taken in wars or purchased through trade. Likewise, the Ottoman Empire enslaved both Europeans and Africans, just as some African tribes enslaved other groups, and Asian societies enslaved people from different races or social classes. Generally, enslavement targeted outsiders, defined by race, religion, nationality, or other characteristics, unless it occurred as a result of debt or punishment. For centuries, Western European Christians justified enslaving pagans from the Balkans or Eastern Europe. Even after Christianity became widespread across Europe, the Catholic Church took considerable time to officially condemn the idea that fellow Europeans could be enslaved as non-Christians. The decision of whom to enslave was less about ideology and more about practical factors, such as availability and the challenges of enforcement. For instance, raiding the Roman Empire to enslave Romans was often too risky. The armed resistance such raids would provoke, along with the possibility of retaliation, made other groups easier and safer to target. This pragmatic approach also explains why enslaving certain populations became less common as powerful nation-states emerged. For example, Turkish enslavement of people from the Caucasus decreased significantly after the region was absorbed into the Russian Empire. While isolated raids continued, large-scale enslavement of Russian subjects was avoided to prevent potential conflict with the Russian state. The formation of nation-states reduced the number of vulnerable regions where people could be captured and enslaved. Once it became impractical for one state to enslave the people of another, piracy and small-scale raids became the primary methods for acquiring slaves. In places like Southeast Asia, where central governments were weaker, pirates continued to target isolated and poorly defended communities. These pirates included groups such as the Chinese, Arabs, Malays, and others from both inside and outside the region. In the 19th century, armed Arab raiders moved into Central Africa and established settlements where they collected slaves and other resources from nearby communities as tribute. While these raiders captured people for slavery, the actual trade of slaves was typically handled by merchants who treated enslaved individuals as just another commodity to be sold. Globally, the slave trade was often dominated by merchant groups. In Europe, Venetians, Greeks, and Jews played key roles, while overseas Chinese traders managed much of the trade in Southeast Asia. Arabs often acted as both raiders and traders in Africa, although it was rare for one person to oversee every stage of the process, from capture to sale. During the medieval period, Italian merchants replaced Jewish traders in the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, taking over much of the slave trade there. Gujarati merchants from India frequently financed the African slave trade, though they typically did not engage in direct trading themselves. In Central Africa, the Yao people, known for their ivory trade, also became prominent slave traders in the region. The process of enslavement rarely required national policies or racial ideologies. All it took was a vulnerable group that could be exploited, regardless of whether they shared cultural or racial similarities with their oppressors. In ancient Greece and Rome, slavery was widespread without any justification based on race. Enslavement throughout history was driven by opportunity and practicality rather than ideology. Vulnerable populations around the world were targeted and exploited whenever conditions allowed it. The slave trade across the world was often managed by merchant communities, such as the Venetians, Greeks and Jews in Europe, the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and Arabs in Africa, who frequently acted as both traders and raiders. Even so, it was rare for a single individual to handle the entire process of enslavement, from capture to sale. In medieval times, Italian merchants began to replace Jewish merchants in the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, overtaking them in the Black Sea slave trade as well. Gujaratis from India, another influential merchant group, financed much of the African slave trade, though they rarely participated directly. Similarly, the Yao people of Central Africa, known for their dominance in the ivory trade, also became major players in the regional slave trade. Neither national policies nor racial ideologies were necessary to justify enslavement. What mattered was the existence of vulnerable populations, regardless of whether they were racially or culturally similar to their oppressors. For example, slavery was common in ancient Greece and Rome without any racial justification. Throughout history, vulnerable groups were exploited whenever opportunities arose. Sailors from Magellan's crew stranded in Southeast Asia were sold into slavery by local inhabitants. In Spain, Moors and Spaniards alternated between enslaving one another depending on circumstances. Similarly, during the Middle Ages, groups living around the Caspian and Black Sea regions captured and sold each other as slaves. In ancient Rome, it was not unusual for soldiers to enslave their enemies, knowing that they themselves might face the same fate if captured. Romans enslaved in Carthage during the war against Hannibal were later repatriated. Jews, Germans, Gauls, and Celts were all enslaved by the Romans. Such practices were driven by self-interest and opportunity, not ideology. Populations subjected to frequent slave raids often endured contempt and mistreatment both during their enslavement and after emancipation. However, this disdain was not the cause of their enslavement, but a consequence of it. In the Islamic world, for instance, there was no initial religious basis for racism, but the widespread enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans by Arabs and Muslims led to racial prejudice in the Middle East. This prejudice developed after the enslavement of Black Africans and had not been evident in earlier interactions with Ethiopians. In Western societies, slavery often gave rise to racism rather than being justified by it. In both North America and South Africa, racist arguments were adopted only after religious justifications for slavery were challenged and found insufficient. However, many other societies never sought to justify slavery with ideology at all. Africa remained a target for exploitation long after other regions became less vulnerable to mass enslavement. The continent's lack of urbanization and its many smaller, isolated communities made it an easier target. More powerful African groups, like the Ashanti and Yao, also preyed on weaker communities, while Arab raiders armed with firearms devastated Central African villages. These raiders not only captured people, but also looted goods, destroyed food supplies, and spread disease through their caravans. Most European traders in Africa acquired enslaved people through purchases from African rulers and merchants, rather than direct capture. Sub-Saharan Africa's fragmented societies made this system particularly effective, as many enslaved individuals had already been captured by others before being sold to Europeans. The expenses of slavery extended beyond capturing people. Maintaining control over enslaved populations was costly, especially in preventing escapes. The system remained viable only as long as these costs were outweighed by the benefits to slaveholders. While enslaved people were often chained during transport, such measures were impractical once they reached their destinations. Armed guards were rarely used to monitor slaves continuously, even in regions like the antebellum South, the Ottoman Empire, or Southeast Asia. Instead, enslavers relied on psychological and social controls, reinforced with brutal punishment for those who resisted. Limiting the knowledge of enslaved people was one way to reduce the costs of maintaining control. This ignorance extended beyond formal education to include a lack of geographical awareness. People enslaved far from their homelands were less likely to escape successfully. For example, when the Dutch ruled Java, they preferred importing slaves from other regions to prevent collective resistance. In contrast, when the British tried using local slaves in Banten, they faced frequent escapes. Similarly, Malay and Indonesian slaves were often transported thousands of miles to South Africa, just as Africans were taken to the Americas. While it was not impossible to enslave people in their own territories, it was often more difficult and costly, making it less common. When economists define costs as foregone benefits, it reveals additional, less visible expenses for both slave owners and slave-owning societies. These hidden costs were nonetheless significant. In systems of relatively unmodified slavery, like those in the Western Hemisphere, the scope of work that enslaved people could perform was restricted by the need to maintain strict control. In many parts of the Americas, enslaved populations often outnumbered free populations. This imbalance made it essential to prevent escapes, suppress rebellions, and maintain subordination. As a result, enslaved people were not employed in activities that required education, independence, or the use of money or weapons. This narrow use of labor created missed opportunities to develop and utilize the full potential of the enslaved population. These limitations imposed not just immediate costs on society, but also long-term consequences, especially after emancipation, when millions of uneducated individuals were left unequipped to contribute effectively to their communities or support themselves. Unmodified slavery reduced the productivity of enslaved individuals and stunted the development of their potential. Over time, the effects were compounded as one generation of freed descendants inherited the disadvantages imposed by the conditions experienced by the generation before them. This perpetuated the harm, affecting both the individuals and the broader society. Race-based slavery added even more costs. Keeping enslaved people isolated and divided made controlling them easier. For instance, the Dutch in Java intentionally mixed enslaved individuals from different origins to prevent solidarity. In the Western Hemisphere, enslaved Africans from various tribes, speaking different languages, were similarly preferred for the same reason. However, in the United States, the high cost of importing new enslaved people from Africa led to a population of native-born enslaved individuals as early as colonial times. These native-born communities consisted of families and individuals who shared a common language and culture, which made them harder to isolate and control. The presence of free black people also increased the cost of maintaining slavery. Free blacks often helped enslaved individuals escape, either on their own or through organized efforts, like the Underground Railroad. Even without active involvement, their existence created discontent among the enslaved, who could see others of their race living in freedom. This discontent could reduce productivity or lead to resistance. Slaveholders were aware of these challenges and sought to make life difficult for free blacks near plantations. Discriminatory laws and practices were designed to restrict their freedoms, humiliate them, and make them appear less desirable as examples to those still enslaved. For instance, free blacks were sometimes forced to step off sidewalks to allow white pedestrians to pass. Such measures were most extreme in areas dominated by plantations and less common in cities or regions with fewer plantations. These policies, while aimed at controlling free blacks, often pushed them to relocate to urban areas or northern states. As a result, the proportion of free black people in the Deep South declined, while the enslaved population shifted southwestward to accommodate the expansion of cotton farming. One significant way free blacks unintentionally raised the cost of slavery was through literacy. Despite being excluded from public schools and often forbidden to establish their own, most free blacks in the United States were literate by 1850. Literacy among free blacks posed a threat to the control system of slavery, as it could spread knowledge to enslaved individuals, fueling dissatisfaction and aiding escapes. Consequently, the Southern slave system paid a steep price for maintaining ignorance, sacrificing potential productivity to preserve subordination. In addition to restricting the education of enslaved people, the South also imposed educational limitations on over 250,000 free blacks. These efforts, while not entirely successful, reflected the high cost of suppressing knowledge to maintain control over the enslaved population. These restrictions hindered not only the development of free blacks, but also the society as a whole, which lost out on the contributions of a better educated population. Investment in the manual skills of enslaved people was often more profitable for slaveholders than similar investments in free laborers. When an employer trained a free worker in a craft, that worker could leave to find another job, causing the employer to lose the benefits of the training. Even if the worker stayed, the employer might face demands for higher wages to reflect the worker's increased value. Refusing such demands risked pushing the worker to seek employment elsewhere. None of these issues arose for slaveholders, as enslaved people had no ability to demand wages or choose their employers. Additionally, a skilled enslaved person could be sold for a higher price, allowing the owner to recoup the training investment. This system led to the widespread cultivation of manual skills among enslaved black populations in the South. Plantations operated as self-sufficient communities, requiring enslaved people to perform a variety of skilled tasks. These skills often carried over into the occupations of free people of color during and after slavery. Black craftsmen were common throughout the South, as they were in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Similarly, skilled enslaved individuals of various racial backgrounds were found in other slave societies, both ancient and modern. In many places, societies with fewer concerns about slave revolts could afford to train enslaved people in a wider range of abilities and talents. In some regions, enslaved individuals developed skills beyond manual labor. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, male slaves often gained administrative, political, and military expertise, while female slaves serving elite men were trained in music and social etiquette. However, societies with large plantations and enslaved populations of different races often faced stricter constraints. Such societies prioritized control and security over developing the talents of enslaved individuals. In contrast, societies with more diverse, linguistically and racially mixed slave populations often had greater flexibility in educating and utilizing the abilities of enslaved people. Enslaved individuals were viewed as capital investments in most slave-owning societies. Their market value represented the anticipated future benefits of their labor. However, the value of enslaved people varied widely depending on the region. In the American South, enslaved individuals cost about 30 times more than those on the African coast. This difference reflected the costs of transportation, the risks of death during transit, and the fact that enslaved people in the United States were typically trained and familiar with their work, making them more productive than newly enslaved individuals who required training. In places closer to Africa, like Brazil, where enslaved people were cheaper, they were often worked to death and replaced by new arrivals, a practice that was too costly in the United States. In the southern United States, dangerous tasks were often assigned to white workers, such as Irish immigrants, instead of enslaved people, as the latter were seen as valuable assets. The high value of enslaved people in the U.S. also led to lower infant mortality rates among children born to enslaved women compared to those in the Caribbean or South America. Enslaved mothers were given lighter workloads during pregnancy and after childbirth, and some care was provided for children during their early years when their economic contribution was minimal. In regions where enslaved adult males from Africa were more readily available, these costs were less often incurred. The different economic circumstances of slavery across regions also influenced treatment. For example, in the West Indies, infant mortality among enslaved people was significantly higher than in the American South. In Brazil, where enslaved populations were predominantly male, women were often kept locked up at night to prevent pregnancies. The existence of more humane laws in Latin American societies has led some to conclude that slaves were treated better there than in regions like the United States, where such protections were absent. However, laws were not always effective constraints. Enslaved individuals who attempted to invoke legal protections often risked severe punishment. Slave prices reflected the dynamics of supply and demand, much like other commodities. In Southeast Asia, male and female slaves were priced similarly until large numbers of male Chinese immigrants arrived in the 18th century. These men created a high demand for female slaves as concubines, causing their prices to rise significantly. In the Ottoman Empire, slave prices varied based on gender, ethnicity, and role. African women were often used as domestic workers, while Circassian women were prized as concubines and commanded much higher prices. Eunuchs, who were rare due to the dangers of castration, were often the most expensive enslaved individuals. Economic factors also influenced slave markets in other ways. In Southeast Asia, increased demand for field laborers led to more frequent slave raids. In West Africa, the practice of killing male captives and enslaving women and children shifted when European demand for male slaves created a new market. When the Atlantic slave trade was suppressed, traditional practices resumed. Declining sugar prices in the 1840s reduced the demand for enslaved people in sugar-producing regions like Brazil, leading to a drop in exports from Mozambique. British efforts to suppress the Indian Ocean slave trade forced traders to use cheaper ships, minimizing losses if their cargo was seized. The value of a slave's life varied depending on perspective. To the enslaved person, their life held inherent value, but to a plantation owner, it represented labor and profit. Overseers, who often had short-term incentives, were more likely to overwork enslaved individuals and neglect their long-term well-being. In contrast, plantation owners living on site had incentives to maintain their enslaved laborers as long-term assets, along with their buildings, equipment, and livestock. Absentee owners, such as those in the West Indies who lived in London, were disconnected from the realities of plantation management, leading to higher mortality rates among enslaved children and neglect of long-term care.